Today I want to have, okay, a conversation with you on African cinema in general.
Okay.
I know most people know you, okay, for your scholarship on African cinema,
Mhm.
but many people, including myself, have been wondering how can, Harrow came to African cinema.
Since you just asked me a second ago about that question, um, I would say that when African cinema was beginning, uh, those of us who were working on African literature naturally were watching the films at the same time. And you know why? Because we would teach Semben Usman's books, and yet he was making films. We would teach Wandabi the novel, and we would teach the film. So it seemed natural to be aware or conscious of both at the same time. I also remembered, I think the first time I saw an African film was when I was in Cameroon in the late 1970s. The French Cultural Center had a series of African films, and I saw a film that mystified everyone at the time called Tuki Buki.
Tukubuki,
It
yes.
was even funnier, and this is a fairly difficult film to sort of grasp what's happening all the time. And much of it was in Wolof. The audience there didn't understand Wolof. It was in Cameroon, and they didn't have subtitles. So people walked out, they were scratching their head. That was the beginning. I think the second was I went to Fespaco in the early 1980s. I was living in Dakar, but Fespaco, it was a chance to go to Fespaco, and I went overland to Bamako, and I took the taxi bus across to Burkina, which was just taking on that name Burkina at the time, and I saw all the films in Fespaco. That's what really introduced me to the film. And I have to say, I continued working on literature heavily at the same time that I was working on film. But my interest in film really grew with time, and now I devote most of my research efforts to African cinema.
Yeah. And by the way, FESPACO is the Pan African Film and Television,
Right.
of Ouagadougou.
Right. So about 10 years after, I don't remember exactly, maybe it was in the mid 1990s, I was holding a conference for the African Literature Association here at Michigan State University. It was the second conference that I was organizing. I called it FESPACO Nights in Michigan. And we invited Jibril Jap Mambeti, all the great critics, and many, Ola Balogun from Nigeria, many great directors, Gaston Caboret. They came here to East Lansing,
Oh,
and
great, yeah.
people who went to that festival will never that conference will never forget that experience that we had. It was very exciting.
Yeah. And you mentioned earlier, your trajectory, going, to Cameroon. It was it at what time and on what occasion did you go to Cameroon?
I went to Cameroon in '77 as a Fulbrighter to teach at the university in Yaoundé. And in fact, I loved it and stayed for 2 years, not for the one. I almost cried when I came home, but I had a job here, so I had to. And then 4 years after Cameroon, I got a Fulbright to do research for a year. And I spent that year in Dakar. So my loyalties got divided, and that was a year in Dakar. And in the years, ever since, it's now been, well, how many? Almost 35 years. I've been back to Dakar. I've been back to Yaoundé occasionally, but Dakar I've taught at the University Cheikh Anta Diop a couple of times. Spent a year there, here, another year there. So it became a kind of a second home and an important part of our lives. And of course, Dakar was an important place for Senegalese cinema, and I did my best in the last 15 years to come as close as I could to the cinematic scene, know the people who were working there, and try to develop my competency through that location.
Ken, to those who don't know your scholarship, your research on African cinema, can you very briefly talk about your research? Could be publications on African cinema.
Well, for African cinema, I guess I have um, some edited volumes that deal with cinema in general. in Africa, but I wrote 2 books. And these 2 books, they were quite different. My first book was an attempt to show the transition that we could see happening in the film from an earlier cinema of resistance, the most well-known figure of a cinema of resistance we could call Senben, but they were that his whole generation largely was marked by that, with a few exceptions like Djibril Mambéty. Mambéty was very influenced by New Wave cinema. It was much more experimental and much less didactic in his approach. But as time went by, there was developments in African film that took us from post-colonial to post-structural changes. And the post-structural meant that we are no longer working under the aegis, under the heading of pure realism and a relatively straightforward political cinema, to one that's much more open to the possibilities of experimentation and the possibilities of nonlinearity in filmmaking. And so that change from the post-colonial to the postmodern is something that my first book dealt with. I was very interested in that transition towards what was then dominant postmodernism. My second book, maybe it's my favorite of the work that I've done, if I may say so. It's a book where I chose an extremely controversial title. It's called Trash. Again, the transition that I'm seeing in Trash is in the direction of what I initially called the decolonized cinema from the beginning. Why would I take a word like trash and use this? The subtitle tells you it's called African Cinema from Below. And what I'm interested in doing is not looking from above, from the dominant perspective, from the dominant viewpoint of dominant culture. I wasn't looking even from the dominant viewpoint within film studies culture, which would take, Western or Hollywoodian values as a way of defining what's important in film. I wanted to know where films that were regarded not as dominant but subordinate, actually what would it look like looking at the world from that perspective. And you could say in a way it's like what would it be to be looking at the world from the perspective not of those who are in control of dominant values, but those who are dominated by those values, both within the cinematic world and within the world of Africa in relationship to the West. And so African cinema from below, the perspective from below, that's the question which becomes dominant there, is the question of value. And what I discovered in the writing of this book is that we have value systems where things that are considered to be trash on the bottom, of little value or no value, in one value system, flip over and become, in fact, of supreme importance in another value system. Everything that turns around identity markers, such as race and gender, are often marked by this hierarchy of values, where it's important to look from a perspective that will reverse the hierarchy itself. And the only way I felt I could undo the hierarchy was to take a term like trash, you call it trash, and then ironically use it to reverse the values themselves.
Yeah. So as if, one man's trash is one man's gold.
Exactly. One man's trash is another man's gold. And in fact, the gold in dominant culture almost always is built upon the exploitation of those who are regarded as lesser or inferior. Well, not just people, but really cinema itself, the cinematic values themselves. For example, to take the most obvious, the most important value in Hollywood film is how much money a film makes, how much it costs to make, and how much money could be recovered.
The gross at the box office.
The gross box office, which ran all the values that determined how the films would be made, how they were structured, and especially what kind of message or values they would put out. How could you be free from that as an independent filmmaker when you're tied to your funding sources? And so if you reconcile yourself to making something which is not of the same quality of image as those that require enormously expensive equipment, which doesn't use actors who are known around the world, but may use, in fact, those are not professional actors. It may be possible to start making a different kind of film. And there's nothing new in this. The idea of what was called imperfect cinema or third cinema goes back to the 1960s when Latin Americans were trying to make revolutionary cinema.
With Gustavo, Octavo, yeah, yeah.
Right.
Now, can you, maybe speak to the current, trends in African cinema? Could be in terms of production or in terms of scholarship.
Well, we have perhaps two different tracks to answer your question. Two or three. The first that springs to mind is that for a long time Francophone cinema has been dominant. For a long time, when you said African cinema, most people were not focusing their attention on either North African. They would take North African as a separate entity, Maghrebian, and that would be within the range, within the world of Francophone culture. And then you had South African, which was also a kind of independent from the rest of Black African cinema. But if we're to look at the dominant filmmakers that we study from the 1970s on, these were people who came from West Africa, from Senegal, from Mali, and from Burkina. They made a body of films. They influenced each other. Two generations emerged, beginning after the late 60s or early 1970s, and great films were made. Often these filmmakers were either political or influenced by the kinds of developments that training in Russia made possible. So the two films that I recommended elsewhere here, those made by Semben and by Sissako, both of those filmmakers got their training.
Yeah, you mean, Bamako and Gelwa.
And Gelwa. And both of the filmmakers, Semben and Sissako, were trained in Moscow. And their socialist realism was dominant in filmmaking practices at that time. So the notion that you're making films that were powerful, that expressed the values of your people, that were no longer subordinate to the West, but that had ultimately an important social and political perspective on the world, which you could not get from Western film, that was an important understanding for many filmmakers in the 70s, 80s, and 90s. But it was very difficult. There were enormous difficulties that these filmmakers...
That's where it comes in the second trend?
No, the second, not quite yet.
Oh, not quite yet.
Simply to say why the problems that the films that were made by these directors had. It's one thing to make a film. It's another to have access to distribution networks.
Distribution, the challenges.
And the challenges in Africa were overwhelming. During the period that these films were developing, the very theaters themselves were deteriorating, and they were owned by distributors who made it very difficult for African films to be seen by Africans on the continent. And so they became increasingly known outside of the continent. And secondly, where was the funding to make the films to come? There were always attempts to get African nations to create cinema support networks and to pay for films, but it didn't last. And they would last for a short period of time and then stop. And so the filmmakers had to turn and scramble to get funding wherever they could. That could be foundations, or it could be national entities in Europe, generally in Europe. And the post-production was often done in Europe. So the difficulties of continuing to make a film every year to find the funds, to find a way to continue to create African films, this was a struggle that African filmmakers had, and often their films would be privileged and seen at festivals abroad, but increasingly not easily accessible.
In their own countries.
In their own countries, even when they were made about their own people, even when they're made in their own languages, with their own casts at home, still, where would they be seen? This was an enormous problem. So the first real breakthrough, and this is the second development, began in the late 1980s and early 1990s. The real major breakthrough came, I would say, in 1992, and it came in Nigeria. And what happened was, one day somebody picked up a camera. They said, I can make a movie, because digital cameras became available, and even before that, making VCR video film became available. And these films were called video video films initially.
Yeah, home videos.
Because they're made like home videos with video cameras. They could be made cheaply, and rather than trying to have a well polished, nor to have a film with an important script that could be developed over months, films came to be made very, very quickly. This developed into an industry of films that were seen locally at home, particularly in Ghana and Nigeria. And as they developed in Nigeria, more and more people got the idea of doing it. If they couldn't show them in movie theaters, they could take a VCR, show it in a tape in somebody's home. They could charge a small amount of money, and an industry was born. Of course, we all know what I'm talking about is something called Nollywood, which was named after Hollywood or Bollywood, the Indian. But it became an industry that developed hundreds of millions of dollars of films that came to be made, and somewhere between perhaps 1,500 and 2,000 films a year were made in Nollywood. And they were shown initially in Nigeria, in Ghana, and eventually in other Anglophone countries in the region. They were also made in Yoruba and Igbo, as well as in English, and so they became immediately accessible for people who were living in the region where the films were being made. That was a revolutionary change.
Yeah, you became, the question that many people ask is that, okay, how come that Francophone or French-speaking, cinema dominated, the African cinema, scene for 2 or 3 decades, and yet they're not being able to make that impact that Nollywood made within, let's say 10 years.
Well, there's the you could almost call it the miracle of the creation of an industry. I know that when I was in Senegal, there was enormous interest in turning out video films and marketing them locally in Dakar. And I spoke to the people who were involved in making films. They said they could not overcome the obstacle of piracy. They could make a video film and anyone could take it. And in fact, the pirates became very good at digitizing the films after the transition from video to digital cinema. To have the digital film shipped immediately, electronically to China. There the Chinese would turn out these VCD, like DVDs. They would turn them out en masse and have them shipped back to Africa where they were sold cheaply. That gave a small window for the filmmakers themselves to try to market their own films. It took a couple of weeks before those Chinese models were coming back in, where they had to try to recover their funds.
But Ken, does it mean that in Nigeria, in Nollywood, they don't face piracy?
They face enormous piracy, and they're fighting against piracy all the time.
But yet they're being more successful than the French-speaking counterparts.
I think that's what I said, the miracle of the market, the way in which it worked in Nigeria. There are a couple of really major market locations where the DVDs or VCDs were being sold. The marketers were tough and aggressive in trying to control the sales of those within their territory. How their toughness meant controlling the sale, I don't know, but I know that they could control it only for a certain period of time. And they did it en masse. And the profits were not always easily accessible. Sometimes the profits were too low for the directors who were emerging to get enough out of it. And so they began to find other ways to market it. They would ship their films, for example, abroad. And so there were locations in New York, and I know particularly in Peckham Rye in London, where they had shops that were specialized in selling Nigerian films. I saw them, and they've become actually reduced in numbers now because increasingly platforms have gone online where the filmmakers are now selling their films to large distributors of television or satellite where they can be sold.
So you have distribution targeting the diaspora, but also via satellite TV channels. Right. If I were to summarize what you said, so you have the major trends in African cinema start with Francophone Africa, the 60s, the 70s, and then you have late 80s and early 90s with the birth, the inception of Nollywood. Are we still in the Nollywood, period, or do we have any shift, or what?
I think
Now?
there's one other shift that
Hmm.
strikes me as being marking our times and um, comes is equally important along with this revolution of Nollywood.
Hmm.
You should understand that Nollywood films were conceived of as really quick, fast, dirty filmmaking.
Hmm.
It became possible to make a film, to write a film and to get it organized in a week, to shoot it in a week, and to do post-production in a week. And so there were studios that got set up in Ghana and Nigeria where every single week they were turning out a film, a new film, and they were being turned out increasingly as formula films, as genre films, films that had none of the kind of, if you will, intellectual or political depth that Francophone films were built upon initially. It was a new notion of filmmaking, and the idea was to be commercial and to please the audience, not to challenge the audience in its thinking or in its values. You can imagine that whole body of people who were trained as professional filmmakers, who went to Russia or went to Paris or went to New York, came back with celluloid film as their ideal and their goal, and participating in the creation of new nations in Africa, being confronted with this Nollywood phenomenon of films that looked to them to be intellectually and artistically inferior. And so they would have no truck with them. They would scorn them. They would not participate in that process. That's changed. Many Nollywood filmmakers now, like for example Kalani or Afolayan, have really great aspirations of making, let's call them important films. They'll hold on to their films until they can get a theatrical release, perhaps in London. Now they're beginning finally to have new cinemas being built in Nigeria, some in other parts of Africa, and if they could have their films shown there, they don't need to worry about the piracy. They won't release it on a DVD format until after they've had theatrical release.
So what you are referring to, is it what, 'cause, what some people, label as new Nollywood, which is a big production
Right.
with, is it that?
It is that. I mean, it's called New Nollywood as though they were a clear marker between Nollywood and New. It's a continuum. People like Kalani have been making movies for 40 years, and so his earlier film Thunderbolt was distributed by California Newsreel before there was such a thing as Nollywood. But the notion of video and then eventually really making digital films and making films that were popular was, I think, the most important point, and that's significant. But there's one other change that I wanted to mention that I think is equally almost revolutionary in its importance for the way that we think about African film. This one is a harder one to say. You know that I talked about Semben being, I don't want to overdo Semben, but for the generation of the filmmakers of the 1970s, he was kind of typical in a sense that these involved individuals who were trained in making film and thought of making their films in Africa for Africans. Even if it was a struggle, that was their goal. Well, the latest generation of African authors as well as filmmakers are living increasingly outside of Africa. They're making films, to be sure, which are African or which they consider African, but what does it mean to be African today in relationship to the notion of what it meant to have been Africa in the years after independence? And the difference is enormous, because after independence, the notion of being Africa was tied to nation building, and it was to create a Senegalese, to create a Cameroonian,
Sense of belonging.
a sense of taking hold of something that had been owned by the outsider, by the colonialists, by the whites in the past, and now to take it and make it one's own. And it was a building, and it was at times it was exhilarating. For example, this whole movement of negritude to find value through race and through racial representation, taking hold of racial representation. It was exhilarating, it was exciting, and at the same time, there was a defiance against those old colonial masters who were still present and still tried to control the process as much as they could. Now we don't live in that world anymore. We live in a world, if I may say, sure, there's part of that is still there. Part of it you may have we no longer have this notion of Africans writing or making movies because they're worried about how Europeans will regard them. They're no longer making movies to shoot back the way, in that old terminology. No, that generation is gone. Rather, we have a generation of people who feel, in a sense, this kind of, if you will, cosmopolitan belonging. The sense of belonging, sure, to Africa, but Africa is no longer a location of isolation. And one may be as thoroughly African in one's intellectual universe, living both inside and outside of the continent. I think of, well, the biggest name in literature these days is Chimamanda Adichie, and Adichie
From Nigeria.
From Nigeria, and she's really writing out of a world in which her training came with American creative writing programs, like many others, or Helen Oyeyemi. I'm thinking of people who live both in Nigeria and in London or in the United States, and who feel equally at home in both locations. Teju Cole is another figure who grew up in Michigan, down the road from here, but he writes also about Lagos and about belonging to the culture in Lagos, or not belonging to the culture in Lagos, but that's what he wants to write about. I see the filmmakers, perhaps some of the most interesting filmmakers of today are living across both worlds, and that includes Bollywood.
Can you give examples of those filmmakers you think?
No, not off the top of my head. It's going to go blank when I try to think of names. They'll come after a while. But a good example maybe Afolayan is one of the.
Or Bekolo, or Jean-Pierre Bekolo.
Yeah, great. So here two examples. Actually, a friend. So you helped me with that a lot. Bekolo and Tenno. These are two filmmakers really wonderful in exemplifying this. Both Bekolo and Tenno are Cameroonian. They both go back to this period, way back to the 90s, before the Nollywood revolution had transformed filmmaking. They were both interested in making films that were substantial and really had important things to say. Tenno more in the older fashioned didactic, I don't want to use that word, but more politically engaged, engagé, a form of filmmaking, which he still does today. And I think he is probably the master of the documentary style in Africa. He's the most important, made great, wonderful films about what it means to be Africa and what it means to be free from the colonial, or the leftovers of the colonial enterprise. Afrique, je te plumerai is one of his early important films. And a leaf, Un feuille dans le vent, a leaf in the wind.
In the wind.
It's a beautiful contemporary film. And where does Tenno live? He lives in France. He lives, in fact, down the road from me in southern France. That's his base. He'll come and live abroad in the United States, and he'll go to Africa to do his filmmaking, but that's where he lives.
So we have, Africa in dialogue, with the rest of the world. It's not, the Africa of the 60s, in terms of nation building. No.
No, exactly. I can't remember the title, maybe you can help me. He made this film, this beautiful film about Namibia, which had been German Southwest Africa. And this was a film where he did his research in Germany, in the archives of how the Germans in the early 20th century had established their colonial control over Southwest Africa, and where they committed genocide. And this was the first really important choice of genocide as a means of conquest that occurred. And then he took himself to Namibia, where he shot with the people who had survived, that experience.
The Guerrero, probably.
Right. Yeah, and who were giving him then a view of people of today looking back upon their past. There we have that tie between Africa and Germany, between the continent, between both continents. And Tenno is perfect for being able to bridge that. Bekolo's, he's again a friend, and I think a great example of the kind of filmmaking that takes that bridge between the worlds. For example, I mean, his first film is Quartier Mozart, which is set in Cameroon in a local quartier where he's showing in a very humorous way the life of people and the kind of patriarchal values that the men were still exhibiting. But his second film, which is called Aristotle's Plot, it was shot in Zimbabwe, and he's using South African actors in that film. He's crossing between English and French. He has two different versions of that film, and it was made to celebrate the year 2000 and African filmmaking, which the BFI wanted to subsidize at that time. So there we have the complete internationalism of Bekolo. Bekolo got his training doing commercial filmmaking in Paris, and he's always lived between Paris and Yaoundé, where he has his home, and his base has been between both worlds. He is the most in between worlds person that you could ever imagine. And so it's appropriate that he makes a film called Les Saignantes, which is impossible to translate, but he calls it the Bloodettes. It's about this new young generation of African women whose goal is no longer to try to free themselves from the men, because they already are way freer than the men will ever be. And of course, it's not like Semben, who goes back to the past, to Emitai or Chedo or films, so that we can now recover, or Afrique Je te plumerai from Tano, where we could recover the past and see it from African eyes.
Valorize the past.
Valorize it. Instead of to the past, he goes to the future. And so he goes to a Yaoundé of 2025.
Yeah, 2025, yes.
Where we have a world which won't resemble the world of today, but where the struggle for freedom is still at the core of the film. Another film that is doing this is Wanuri's film Pumzi. This is like one of the first science fiction almost, or Afrofuturist films, if you like. And she's from Kenya. And there the protagonist lives in a world which has been destroyed by some kind of nuclear war, and she lives in a safe enclave away from the world outside. And so again, it's set in the future, and it looks like astronauts or something, the costuming that we have in that film. So think about that compared with the earliest films from Francophone West Africa dealing with excision or with the corruption of the government and things like that. Think of what a vast change we have.
What's